So yeah, it's a hard life being a podcaster sometimes, or at least a political podcaster like I am. You know, what if nothing happens? What do you do if you get up in the morning and you look at the news and nothing happened today? Which apparently the BBC has reported like one time in history. There was just no news. I think some people still think that it was some sort of spy message to overseas British agents to activate them in some way, or maybe a test of a similar system. You know, the nuclear submarines used to have to surface every day and check if the BBC World Service was still available to them with a normal radio. And if it wasn't, they were meant to, decide whether to nuke Moscow or something like that. Not having news to talk about is a rarity. But it's kind of getting that way with this coronavirus thing, because what I'm looking for when I decide what to do a show on, it's something big and universal that everyone can get behind as an interesting subject, right? Most of what I do is actually really about entertaining. And if the most interesting or important thing in the world only really matters to one or two people, I'm probably not going to cover it. And if the most important thing in the world is dead boring to everybody, I'm going to work hard to find an entertaining angle to cover it from. It is getting to the stage where people aren't really calling each other anymore, and all that hype about, video conferencing culture arising is falling by the wayside because no one has anything to talk about. If you were, for instance, in intensive care for 3 weeks, what would you have missed? In the last few weeks, what major events have been going on that you might be behind on if you were in hospital for that period? So yeah, it is Ev on everything, and as usual, it's not about everything. This time, it's about Boris Johnson returning from hospital, okay? You can find me, Ev, on Twitter, at Ev Buckley, and you can find the show at Ev on everything, where I'm going to link to various things that I mention in the show today, just in case you're not up to speed on them either, like Boris. Now, Boris is back in number 10 as we speak, okay? But he was away since about the 5th of April. Okay, that's when he was taken to hospital on a Sunday night. And it's a move that he probably regards, let's face it, as the equal of Winston Churchill entering number 10 Downing Street in 1940 to take over the running of the Second World War. It was 18 years after Churchill had been unseated by a real-life Dickens character in an election. The guy's name was Edwin Scrimgeour, and he was an prohibitionist. He wanted to ban booze, so it was like literally a Dickens character. And considering Boris Johnson looks up to Winston Churchill so much and probably has a soft spot for some of the more outlandish Dickens characters, I can imagine he felt a little bit Churchillian walking back into work after his interregnum. He returned months before many medical professionals would have expected a intensive care patient to come back to work. And that, of course, led to the kind of people who are just asking questions to just ask questions. And the questions were as stupid as you can imagine, because they were basically these people asking rhetorically, could Boris Johnson have a whole team of tame NHS employees? All of the consultants and doctors and nurses, all the cleaners, all the admin staff, all the porters, everyone involved in running a major central London hospital on side with Team Boris for the nefarious purposes of pulling a sickie to get some public sympathy. This is the theory that people are coming out with about maybe Boris Johnson didn't really have coronavirus based on the fact that he never had to go on a ventilator and on the fact that he returned to work so fast. I have a kind of a different take on it. I think he's like a shit Captain America. Captain America, of course, was frozen in the Arctic from 1944 all the way through until, well, 2011 in the modern film versions. He missed a few things while he was frozen, like the climax and worst part of the Second World War. And it's a little bit like with Boris Johnson. He was absent, we hope, for the peak of coronavirus here in the UK. Death rates have started to fall. And as we know, death rates follow infection rates from several weeks before. And the idea would be that we're seeing the benefit of all of the social distancing that we put in place a few weeks ago. Okay? We've all been locked down for 3 or 4 weeks by now. And we want to be seeing the death rates come down 3 or 4 weeks after that. And we are, which is great. Okay? But a bit like Captain America missing, Hiroshima and so on, Boris Johnson wasn't around for the worst of this, when the deaths got to their absolute peak, again, we hope, when we realized that people just weren't counting deaths in care homes and outside hospitals. And basically he went in with the deaths at approximately 5,000 people, as we thought at the time. We now know it was probably a lot higher. And he's come out to see about 10 times that much. That's a big difference. Okay? That's coming out of hospital to realize that everything that you worked for, everything you were trying to achieve, has failed. They said when this thing was kicking off, if they could keep it to less than 20,000 deaths, that would be a success. We're well over twice that now. It has not been a success. And a better word for something that has not been a success is often a failure. And it sounds harsh, but the Tory government have failed to deal with this crisis, and Boris wasn't around for the climax of the failure. But he's back anyway. And having had a brush with among the most serious illnesses you can possibly have, people were hoping he might have changed. I think they mistook Boris Johnson changing for Boris Johnson changing his mind. I don't think Boris Johnson is likely to fundamentally change as a human being at this point. Maybe he will. I don't know him personally. But you don't get the impression that he is given to sudden road to Damascus moments where he realizes it's all been wrong and he's got to shift everything about his thinking and opinions on, how his life is going or how his career is going. Or, for instance, the politics governing the United Kingdom at the moment. Instead, he's much more the type who just changes his mind with the wind on minor things because it suits him politically to do so, right? As it is, people really believed that this experience might knock some of the bluster out of him. They thought he might come back out in front of number 10, a more humble and chastened man who had made certain decisions that led to the deaths of people from coronavirus. And having suffered it himself, he might take a moment, he might pause, he might be more reflective. But, this wasn't going to knock the bluster out of him like the way someone might knock over a 10-year-old child on a Japanese rugby pitch while they're the mayor of London. Those people who thought that he might suddenly have the scales fall from his eyes were predictably wrong. He was immediately back to shambolically inappropriate similes. He likened dealing with COVID-19 to wrestling an invisible mugger. Now, he claims to speak from experience on this, which I assume means that he didn't need a ventilator because he chased the virus on a bike and called it an oik. That's an assumption based on the relatively safe assumption that we're not talking about a real invisible mugger here. A real mugger is something he does have experience with. He once rescued a documentary filmmaker from 3 supposedly feral girls of about 12 in London by chasing them on his bike and calling them oiks. And it worked. So maybe he tried it on coronavirus, and maybe that's why he never needed to be put on a ventilator. Who knows? More realistically, he was probably talking about his experience with COVID-19 and how having experience with dealing with it means that he was qualified to tell the United Kingdom that, they're dealing with this whole thing as a nation is much like wrestling an invisible mugger. So yeah, inappropriately flippant language is basically Boris Johnson's thing, and he's back on that particular horse immediately. If you scratch the surface of the remark, though, it becomes a little more problematic. He's likening a spell in hospital in intensive care with the experience of the UK nation dealing with an ongoing lockdown. Remember, the overwhelming majority of people in the UK never have to deal with the virus itself, and of the people who do have to deal with it, the overwhelming majority of them deal with it as a particularly severe fever. And that's it. Okay? Not many people are literally dying of this or literally in intensive care in the manner of Boris Johnson's experience. Boris Johnson's experience of the coronavirus crisis as a whole is always being shielded and cosseted from it. We wish it weren't so, but Boris Johnson is a key member of the British government. He is not holed up in a too small flat with too many kids and no park nearby and 4-hour queues for the local Asda. Boris Johnson is not in a situation where he is not able to visit his dying relatives, though it bears pointing out he may find himself in that position before this is over. What I'm saying is his experience of being in hospital was not that. He never ended up on the ventilator. Nobody ever told his family to gather around, but they can't see him. He was never told, this is it, we don't have anything else we can help you with, and it's time to inform your next of kin. I assume. Maybe he was. Maybe there's been some spin put on this idea that he was never on a ventilator and it never got that bad for him, that he was put in intensive care when his blood oxygen got low, but it never kind of approached death's door. That's what we were told. I assume it's true. I don't actually think that any sane Prime Minister, and Boris Johnson is sane, appearances to the contrary, I don't think that any sane kind of Prime Minister would ever lie about something like that. He would need too many people to back him up in it. It would be too catastrophically bad for him if it ever came out that he had been lying. So assuming that his kind of advice, or what we were told about the medical advice that he was given and the treatment he was given, were correct, Boris Johnson has not found himself in the situation that many of the worst affected people have. Okay? He's not found himself in a situation that many of the people he's seeking to reassure have found themselves in, and his claim to know from experience how Britain is faring or what Britain is having to deal with is, it's a bit high-handed, isn't it? To be like, here I am in my ivory tower with all of my money and all of my advisors and all of my helpers and everything kind of laid out for me. And I know from experience that, we are winning the invisible mugger wrestling match. And there's people who are not winning this match. There's people who are, reliant on food deliveries because they can't go outside their own home because they're old and infirm in the first place and they don't have living relatives to help them out. So they're sitting at home completely cut off from the entire world, reliant on somebody from Tesco or somewhere showing up with a bag of food every now and again. Imagine how vulnerable that person feels. Imagine how powerless and afraid they could be. And Boris Johnson is telling them, oh, we're on top of it, it's fine. I know, because I was in intensive care. This is old Boris. This is bung a bob for a big Ben Bong Boris. Which I'm surprised I said first time in one go without screwing it up. This is the kind of Boris Johnson who speaks off the cuff without thinking about his own staggering levels of privilege and without thinking of his own staggering levels of responsibility to everyone around him. He has not learned. Unless, of course, he has learned. And it's been true all along that Boris Johnson, the front, is a huge clown act of a Machiavellian political genius who puts on all this stuff in order to hoodwink everyone, lull them into a false sense of security and misdirect from everything he's doing. The Boris Johnson of walking into a fridge to hide from questions. If you believe that, then maybe he's come out with a deliberate ploy to lead off with a shambolic speech that reinforces the idea that he hasn't changed. But maybe behind the scenes he has learned a great deal about this. After all, it would be hard to believe he hadn't learned anything. He was very, very severely ill, right? And while he may never have gotten that conversation with the doctor that says we're leaving you on the ventilator, but there's nothing we can do, we're counting hours, he still was in a very, very serious condition. He still would have had nights of thinking about that happening to him before he was given a more positive prognosis. Even Boris Johnson surely would have learned something from that, right? Maybe, maybe not, who knows. In any case, while he was in there, he missed some developments. Okay? As we always have to remember, these things work on a kind of a delay. Things that we're doing today to deal with the coronavirus pandemic are going to have their effects in a few weeks. Many of the people who are dying right now as Boris comes out of intensive care or comes out of hospital and retakes his duties as Prime Minister, they were infected while he was last in charge of government, and it's taken this long for their condition to worsen to the point where they die. Not everyone has that experience. Some people, it comes on very quickly, but in the main, as the kind of advice goes, you get infected about a week before you get symptoms, about a week before the symptoms become very severe and then hopefully dissipate and go away, or they get worse and a week after that you're in serious trouble. That's the broad sweep of how they think this thing usually works, though there's always outliers where it works differently. So if you were following Boris Johnson's advice, relying on Boris Johnson's leadership and so on in early April, and you contracted the virus, you could be dying in hospital today as Boris comes back to work. That can't be a good feeling. Not just because you're dying, but because you are going to feel like you did everything right and you followed all of that leadership and so on. And Boris didn't. Boris was out handshaking everyone and so on. Boris was there holding public meetings and press conferences without proper distancing and all the things that people reported before he got ill, and he survived it. I'm honestly glad that he survived. It's a very good thing. I'm delighted. In fact, I wouldn't have liked Boris Johnson to die. I wouldn't have liked the sitting Prime Minister of the United Kingdom to die. But if you were in a critically ill condition right now because of some of the decisions that Boris's government made, must be strange to see him recover right at the time that you enter the last kind of downslope. Though speaking of downslopes, overall deaths are sloping downwards. Okay? Not always. There's always some jitter in these results. They always go up and down, and you always have to remember that we don't know what's going on out in the world in care homes and private homes. We don't know how many people we're going to ultimately count, and importantly, we don't know how many excess deaths over and above the usual March and April we're going to find when we look back on this. In the broadest sense, we can take all of those excess deaths and link them to coronavirus because a huge number of them are going to be caused by coronavirus. There'll be deaths that wouldn't have happened if we weren't locked down. Deaths that wouldn't have happened if coronavirus hadn't contributed to something else. Deaths that wouldn't have happened if there hadn't been, changes to people's social kind of situations, their home situations, their work situations, and so on. In Ireland, I believe they had almost an entire month with no road deaths. 0. They didn't quite make it to the end of April with no road deaths, but they got very, very close. And that's, I suppose, an opposite example of how you can see death rates affected by coronavirus without coronavirus being the cause of the deaths. And we're going to look back on this whole time, and we're going to see a lot more deaths for the last few months than we would have seen in a normal year. And roughly, as a rule of thumb, you can bung all of those deaths under the heading of coronavirus because they happened because of the coronavirus pandemic, even if not because of the virus. Okay? We're going to be looking at that, and we are going to be asking very, very serious questions. Boris Johnson took the decisions that put us in the situation that led to many of those deaths. And if those decisions didn't lead to coronavirus being dealt with quickly and we end up with 50,000 coronavirus deaths regardless, that's going to be a big problem, right? So the point of the episode really is to contrast the situation facing Boris Johnson before he went into hospital and the situation facing him as he leaves. Okay? Before he left work and after he returned, maybe is a better way of putting that. A lot of countries have had differing outcomes in the intervening weeks. Some of them are opening up, like New Zealand. Some of them need to close down a bit harder, like America. And things have changed fundamentally. But before we get into that kind of stuff, we're just going to do the podcast dance. So yes, this is Ev on Everything. Thank you so much for listening. I'm Ev, and the show isn't really about everything, but if you want to talk to me about anything, you can find me on Twitter at EvBuckley, and you can find the show with links to various things that I've been talking about and mentioning today on Twitter at Ev on Everything. You can email me at evoneverything@gmail.com if you would like to use some old school communication. And I'm going to ask you the usual thing that I'm going to ask you, if you could please rate this podcast as highly as you can wherever it is that you listen. Share it among all of the people you can share it with. After all, you have fantastic taste. You are listening to me. That makes you a taste maker among your peers and friends and colleagues. You should get out there and use your powers for good. Tell them what they should be listening to, this show in particular. And you should give a review if you can, even if it's only a few words long. Taking a moment to leave a review gives the podcast a huge boost, because people coming and finding the podcast and seeing the review see that people listening to the podcast as caring enough to stop and type for a moment and set out a few thoughts. That's actually quite a strong indicator of how good the show is and how much people care about it, regardless of what you write. You know, please don't resort to personal insults or anything, but within reason. If you write anything at all in a review, that stands the podcast in good stead. And I would like you to do it, because it's the only way that the podcast can grow, and growing the podcast is the only way the podcast can continue. So if you are enjoying it, get out there and please do that for me. I'll be extremely grateful. But that is enough podcast dancing for today. We are going to get back to a significant 3-week gap in the political career of Boris Johnson. So, 3 weeks ago, seems like a long time in this day and age, and it's been a long time that a few weeks has seemed like a long time. This is something that very much came in with the Trump presidency and with Brexit. The idea that things that happened a few weeks ago are so long ago because so many things have happened within the last few weeks, and each of those is shocking in some way, surprising in other ways, and obviously very unsurprising still other ways. There have been a few things that have happened, obviously. For instance, we were pretty sure 3 weeks ago Kim Jong-un was probably alive. Now we're pretty sure they're probably fitting him for a robot exoskeleton that they haven't revealed yet. I mean, that's a new development, right? It's not finished developing, but something tells me when they finally admit that he's like never woken up from a medically induced coma or whatever it turns out to be, that it's just going to get forgotten again and we'll move on. I did a show back in the dog days, as I like to call them, before Ev on everything, and speaking of which, for long-time listeners, Lupo is asleep on the floor behind me right now. If you hear a dog interrupting and I don't bother editing it out, that's what that is. Anyway, I did a show that was about which national leader was responding worst to COVID-19. And for those of you who go back to listen to it, remember that back in those days I wasn't so interested in researching things or pacing things or editing things, or any kind of professional approach to podcasting. And it's a bit rambling, but it was basically looking at the personal responses of people who should be setting an example. Back then, I reckon Jair Bolsonaro was probably the worst, considering it was his idea that Brazilians can swim in sewage without getting sick, and that makes them immune to coronavirus. I mean, since then, of course, Donald Trump has leapt back into first place with the polar opposite response. Instead of filling your body with dangerous microbes that might sicken you, you can fill it with dangerous cleaning fluids that might kill you. Needless to say, neither approach is recommended, but there's something about Donald Trump's idea flies in the face of so much basic chemistry that I think it's probably stupider than Jair Bolsonaro's. Jair Bolsonaro is probably right that there are people in Brazil who can swim in polluted water in Brazilian cities and not get sick. That probably is true. But, you know, doesn't mean much about coronavirus. There is not a shred of truth to what Donald Trump was on about. But the main change hasn't been that leaders are stupider now than they were before. After all, that is scarcely possible, and I apologize immediately for tempting fate there. I am sure they'll find out a way to be even stupider. The main change is that we're beginning to find real frustration kicking off, resistance to the restrictions placed on people to manage the spread of the disease. That wasn't really there a few weeks ago. Okay, a few weeks ago, the idea that you might do something like tweet that you were going to ignore distancing guidelines was unthinkable. Okay. We were all rowing in behind this idea that we will pull together and we will beat this thing by isolating and all that. Okay. Now, you know, it's a bit different. But back then, I don't mean like the armed militias running around in America. That's not what I mean. What I mean is we were laughing at Kyle Walker for, supporting local businesswomen, but also thinking that maybe it was the end of him ever getting picked for England again. He would not be the first professional footballer in English football to use a prostitute, let's face it. Probably not even the first to use a prostitute in a group environment with a mate. Um, it really was the fact that he didn't think that social distancing applied to him. He reckoned, I'm a big, rich Premiership footballer. I shouldn't have to give up my sex life like so many other people have to. Not for me, Snapchat and sexting. After all, I'm famous. What if a picture of my penis gets out there? Instead, he's like, I will just dial a woman. I'll just call somebody up and bring them over here and pay them to take this risk. Pay them to potentially contract this virus, and there's a lot of connotations about sexual behavior in that, right? But pay them to potentially contract this virus and risk contracting it myself just so I can get laid. That seemed like a much, much worse offense. It's still kind of hilarious. We love the idea of this supposedly rich, famous, successful guy, needing to pay for sex. That's a awful reductive attitude to sex work that ignores lots of the important things that sex work provides for people who are not in the fortunate Kyle Walker situation, both for its providers and for the punters concerned. But, we like having a bit of a laugh at somebody caught in that situation, okay? And that was like several weeks ago, right at the start of this. And then it was, sighing and eye rolling when Spurs players were informally training together. And you have a little bit of sympathy for them. You're like, professional athletes, if they go off the boil, they could lose their spot in the team to somebody who broke the rules a bit and kept training if they got away with it. They'll feel pressured to keep their skills up because that's their whole job, okay? If they are rusty when they go back, that's a big problem. So it was a bit of a sigh and an eye roll, and one would hope that they got fined by the club and slapped on the wrist and all that stuff, but not a massive deal. Now we've reached Alexander Lacazette breaking the rules to have his car cleaned, And that's really a different order of violation. And I say that as an Arsenal fan, If you literally cannot get through this thing without a valet making a house call to clean the car you're probably not supposed to be using anyway, I just don't understand that. It is a real step change, a quantum leap, or whatever you want to call it, in the attitude to the lockdown. Standards are slipping, right? Fines have become the usual method of enforcing this stuff. There's small on-the-spot fines everywhere all over the world, but Germany has gotten up to 5 grand for not wearing a mask. There have been 3,200 fines in the UK, and that's expected to increase. Johnson went away in an atmosphere of encouraging solidarity, and he returned to one of increasing acceptance that some people just don't have the sense of civic duty or the enlightened self-preservation instincts to deal with this stuff for very long. They can't go to McDonald's, A mate of mine texted me this morning from New Zealand saying there was a 2-hour queue for McDonald's on the first day that McDonald's opened down there. That's the kind of thing people are missing. You never want a bread queue in a place like the UK, or anywhere in the world for that matter. Bread queues shouldn't be considered normal anywhere. Right? But there are some broken economies in the world, and there are places where people are extremely poor and bread is hard to come by, for instance, or other staples. It's a euphemism for having to queue for necessities. But these are not bread queues, not in the UK. These are The local supermarket doesn't have plain flour, so I can't have pancakes queues. And it's hard not to be disdainful of people who can't handle this, right? You're talking about people who genuinely believe they need to break the rules because the detailing on the magnesium wheels on their car isn't as awesome as it was now that it's been parked gathering dust for a couple of weeks. That is madness. It's completely insane. And Johnson has come back to a different kind of problem than the one that he left behind. So Johnson's come back onto the steps of number 10 with his usual bluster. But the mood in the country has changed. His approach is all empty rhetoric. It's waffle, it's grandstanding, national pride. It fit the ancient history of 3 weeks ago better. Of course, what would have fit everything even better would have been a coherent strategy to deal with the virus according to international best practices, along with proper planning and preparation and reaction and purchasing supplies and equipment. But the past is the past. This is the all-new, recovered, experience-tempered Boris, and his abject failings can't be pinned on him, much like the way nothing at all can be pinned on him, because he doesn't accept the existence of the concept of responsibility. And we're getting to the part of the story where responsibility is the key. It's the only thing really right now. Europe is winding down its emergency apparatus. It's closing giant morgues. It's closing mass graves. The UK is further back along that curve. It's on track to become potentially the worst affected country in Europe. But it's getting there. The ventilator shortage has been averted. There seems to be enough ICU beds. Okay? We're going to keep working. We're going to keep trying. We're going to keep isolating and all these things. But it seems like we have the measure of the problem. Now comes the time for investigations and for learning. Now is the time for inquiries. And that needs a measured, confident, careful hand at the tiller, and Boris, he is not that. Boris Johnson is the kind of guy who stuffs his, backroom special advisor on a medical and scientific advisory panel, and the only possible reason that Dominic Cummings could possibly be there is to intimidate them, right? He has nothing to offer. He is not supposed to be there in terms of providing, context or input or, information. He has no standing to be in that room. It's full of, career scientists, professors of various things, mostly medical. And he has nothing to add. They should be providing the advice to government, and government should be deciding what to do. And, random unelected special advisors should have no they should have no part in any of this. But of course, we all know that this one special advisor is special and different. Okay? He still shouldn't be in that room. But that's the kind of guy Boris Johnson is. Boris Johnson puts his guy in the room because he has no interest in inquiries or the truth or responsibility. This is a guy who still won't release reports about his own, presumably ex-girlfriend, and his involvement or the involvement of Russia in his election as Prime Minister. He's got the reports. They exist. He just won't let them out. And he's brazening that out, going like, I don't have to let them out. I don't have to be responsible for this. There's something in there that I don't want out there. And I don't even care if everyone knows that I don't want it out there. It's not getting out. That's not the guy you want in charge of the inquiries. That's not the guy you want in charge of policing when it comes down to breaking up parties, fining people, forcing people to stay at home. The first time somebody breaches isolation and causes an outbreak cluster, what's Boris Johnson going to do? Does he have the spine for this? I don't think so. He'll come out and he'll bluster more. Other people will make the big decisions. that bluster and that, national pride at the cost of everything else would have been perfect if those people making the other decisions were making good decisions a month ago. Then the leadership, the example, and the pride, bringing people together and everything, would have worked well. But when it's a guy who's going around shaking hands and talking down the seriousness of the issue and not bothering to, collaborate with Europe on various matters because he's ideologically opposed to it, he doesn't want to look bad in Brexit negotiations later, that's not the guy you want in charge. And unfortunately, it's the guy we have. So Boris Johnson left a bad situation, a really bad situation, that he was making worse. He's come back to a worse situation that he is even more poorly suited to dealing with. That's really sad. We don't really have a mechanism to get rid of a prime minister that quickly. We're stuck with him. And he is awful for this job. Anyway, that was Ev on everything on Boris Johnson coming back to work after a very unfortunate brush with serious illness. I'm glad he's okay. I'm not glad he's in number 10. But I'm glad you're listening to this show. That makes me feel good, especially because you got to the end. Sometimes people don't get to the end of these things. You deserve a pat on the back from somebody that you are isolated with who can do so with appropriate social distancing in place. So, again, find me on Twitter at Ev Buckley. Find the show at Ev on everything. You can talk to me about the show, and you can see some of the instances that I talked about today. Some of that Boris Johnson stuff is like a decade old now, but, when you barrel through a poor 10-year-old rugby kid while representing a city of 10 million people, that sticks with you, right? You want to see that happen, and you can with the internet. It'll be on the Ev on Everything Twitter for your delectation. Thank you again for listening, and go and share this as widely as you can. Go and rate it and review it and all those things, because, as I said, it is absolutely essential. Thank you so much for listening. We'll be back on Friday, and we hope to see you then.